Hello everyone. In today's presentation, we'd like to cover 2 points: the somatic symptom and related disorders and dissociative disorders together with Miss Shaira Prima. But before we go to the main topic, let's briefly discuss first where did these symptoms and disorders begin. Somatoform or somatic symptoms and dissociative disorders are strongly linked historically, and evidence indicates they share common features. Later on, we will discuss what dissociative disorder mean. So, to further discuss to you the somatic symptoms, we have here the hysteria. Hysteria is the term that dates back to the Greek physician Hippocrates and the Egyptians before him. Hysteria suggests that the cause of these disorders, which were thought to occur primarily in women, can be traced to a wandering uterus. In other words, hysteria, from the Greek hystera or womb, is the term used to describe emotional excess. Hysterical and neurosis, on the other hand, are used to be categorized under one general heading, which is called hysterical neurosis. But the term hysterical came to refer more generally to physical symptoms without known organic cause or to dramatic or histrionic behavior thought to be characteristic of women. For instance, when someone responds in a way that seems disproportionately emotional for the situation, they are often described as hysterical. Furthermore, Sigmund Freud suggested that in a condition called conversion hysteria, unexplained physical symptoms indicated the conversion of unconscious emotional conflicts into a more acceptable form. The historical term conversion remains with us and we are still using it. However, the prejudicial and stigmatizing term hysterical is no longer used. If you can still remember in psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theory, it was mentioned that Anna O was once became the patient of Freud and Joseph. She was a young woman experiencing the symptoms of hysteria, and hysteria during late 1800s came to be viewed as psychological disorder. But then again, I mentioned earlier that in modern psychology, the prejudicial and stigmatizing term hysterical is no longer used. And of course, to explain to you further the neurosis itself, the term neurosis, as defined in psychoanalytic theory, suggested a specific cause for certain disorders. Specifically, neurotic disorders resulted from underlying unconscious conflicts, anxiety that resulted from those conflicts, and the implementation of ego defense mechanisms. Okay, so somatic symptom and related disorders will be discussed by Ms. Shaira Prima.
To explain further the topic, somatic symptoms and related disorder is categorized into two parts. First is involuntary and second is voluntary. Under involuntary are somatic symptom disorder or SSD, illness anxiety disorder or IAD, and conversion disorder, while the remaining two, factitious and malingering, belongs to voluntary. Somatic symptom disorder are also considered as physical disorder. SSD has the characteristics of distressing or result in significant disruption of life. The common severe symptom is pain, may it be localized pain or relatively nonspecific like fatigue, series of stress and emotion, illusion of series of chronic disease that does not exist or hard to diagnose. Here's an example of someone who has an SSD. Her name is Linda. Linda, an intelligent woman in her 30s, came to our clinic looking distressed and pain. As she sat down, she noted that coming into the office was difficult for her because she had trouble breathing and considerable swelling in the joints of her legs and arms. One section, some 5 pages long, described her contacts with the healthcare system for major difficulties only. Times, dates, potential diagnosis, and days hospitalized were noted. The second section, 1.5 single-spaced pages, consisted of a list of all medications she had taken for various complaints. She felt like she had any one of a number of chronic infections that nobody could properly diagnose. She had begun to have these problems in her teenage years. She often discussed her symptoms and fears with doctors and clergy. Drawn to hospitals and medical clinics, she had entered nursing school after high school. However, during hospital training, she noticed her physical condition deteriorating rapidly. She seemed to pick up these diseases she was learning about. A series of stressful emotion events resulted in her having to leave nursing school. After developing unexplained paralysis in her legs, Linda was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, and after a year she regained her ability to walk. On discharge, she obtained disability status, which freed her from having to work full-time, and she volunteered at the local hospital. With her chronic but fluctuating incapacitation, on some days she could go in and on some days she could not. She was rapidly seeing a family practitioner and 6 specialists who monitored various aspects of her physical condition. She was also seeing 2 ministers for pastoral counseling. The causes of these are eventual social isolation, which is continual, develop new symptoms, which is something new, and to receive sympathy and attention. It is hard to cure people with SSD, but they can undergo cognitive behavioral therapy to provide reassurance, to reduce stress, and minimize help-seeking behavior. To prevent continuous episodes of this is to avoid stress and being surrounded by people with mild to severe cases of different illnesses. Our next topic is that I need to present to you is IAD, or illness anxiety disorders that performs excessive health related behavior. For example, repeated checks on their body to look for any signs of symptoms, or exhibits maladaptive avoidance, like avoiding doctor's appointments and hospitals. In some cases, the anxiety leads to maladaptive avoidance of situations like visiting sick family members or activities like exercise, because they fear that this might jeopardize their health. They have extensive yet unsatisfactory medical care, though some may be too anxious to seek medical attention. I show a sample case of IAD. The patient's name is Gail. Gail was married at 21 and looked forward to a new life. As one of many children in a lower middle-class household, she felt weak and somehow neglected and suffered from low esteem. An older stepbrother berated and belittled her when he was drunk. Her stepmother and stepfather refused to listen to her and believe her complaints. But she believed that marriage would solve everything. She was finally someone special. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. She soon discovered her husband was continuing an affair with an old girlfriend. 3 years after her wedding, Gail came to our clinic complaining of anxiety and stress. She was working part-time as a waitress and found her job extremely stressful. Although, to the best of her knowledge, her husband had stopped seeing her former girlfriend. She had trouble getting the affair out of her mind. Although Gail complained initially of anxiety and stress, it soon became clear that she had major concerns were about her health. Anytime she experienced minor physical symptoms such as breathlessness or headache, she was afraid she had a serious illness. A headache indicated a brain tumor. Breathlessness was an impending heart attack. Other sensations were quickly elaborated into the possibility of AIDS or cancer. Gail was afraid to go to sleep at night for fear that she would stop breathing. She avoided exercise, drinking, and even laughing because the resulting sensation upsets her. Public restrooms and on occasion public telephones were feared a source of infection. The major trigger of uncontrollably anxiety and fear was the news in the newspaper and on television. Each time an article or show appeared on the disease of the month, Gail found herself irresistibly drawn into it, intently noting symptoms that were part of the disease. 4 days afterwards, she was vigilant, looking for the symptoms in herself and often noticing some physical sensation that she would interpret as the beginning of the disease. She even watched her dog closely to see whether he was coming down with the dreaded disease. Only with great effort could she dismiss these thoughts after several days. Real illness in a friend or relative would incapacitate her for days at a time. Gail fears developed during the first year of her marriage, around the time she learned of her husband's affair. At first, she spent a great deal of time and more money than they could afford going to doctors. Over the years, she heard the same thing during each visit. "There's nothing wrong with you. You're perfectly fine." Finally, she stopped going, as she became convinced her concerns were excessive. But her fears did not go away and she was chronically miserable. Individuals who suffer IAD are easily alarmed about illnesses, such as by learning about someone else falling ill or reading health news stories. Major life stress or a serious but ultimate benign threat to the individual's health. Functional consequences of people who have IAD have often interfere with personal relationship, disrupt family life, and damage occupational performance. Conversion disorder or neurological symptoms has the characteristics of motor symptoms include weakness or paralysis, abnormal movements such as tremor or dystonic movements, gait, abnormalities, abnormal limb posturing. Sensory symptoms include altered, reduced, or absent skin sensory, vision or hearing. Episodes of abnormal generalized limb shaking with apparent impaired or loss of consciousness may resemble epileptic seizure. Other symptoms include reduced or absent speech volume like dysphonia or aphonia, altered articulation, a sensation of a lump in the throat, and diplopia. Attacks resembling epilepsy or syncopes. The occurrence of closed eyes with resistance to opening or a normal simulation electroencephalogram. although this alone does not include all forms of epileptic or syncope. For visual symptoms, tubular visual field or tunnel visual. Here's an example of a person who has conversion disorder. Wait. Her name is Eloise. Eloise sat on a chair with her legs under her, refusing to put her feet on the floor. Her mother sat close by, ready to assist her if she needed to move or get up. Her mother had made the appointment and with the help of a friend had all but carried Eloise into the office. Eloise was a 20 years old of borderline intelligence who was friendly and personable during the initial interview and who readily answered all questions with a big smile. She obviously enjoyed the social interaction. Eloise's difficulty walking developed over 5 years. Her right leg had given away and she began falling. Gradually, the condition worsened to the point that 6 months before her admission to the hospital, Eloise could move around only by crawling the floor. Physical examinations revealed no physical problems. Eloise presented with classic case of conversion disorder, although she was not paralyzed. Her specific symptoms include weakness in her legs and difficulty keeping her balance, with the result that she fell often. This particular type of conversion type is called astasia abasha. Eloise lived with her mother, who ran a gift shop in the front of her house in a small rural town. Eloise had been schooled through special education programs until she was about 15. After this, no further programs were available. When Eloise began staying home, her walking began to deteriorate. The treatment of this is same for SSD, with emphasis on resolving life, stress, or conflict and reducing help-seeking behavior. The causes of this social influence, life stresses, or psychological conflict, and reduced by incapacitating symptoms. Factitious disorders. This is the 4 basic processes in the development by Freud. Experience traumatic event and unconscious conflict, can cope with conflict and anxiety, make it unconscious. Anxiety escalates the threatens to emerge into consciousness, having converts it to physical symptoms to relieve pressure of having to cope with the conflict, sympathy and attention from loved ones, and may be excused from difficult situations or tasks. Factitious disorder, as example of this is those people who act like they have something, or they fall into deathly diseases to gain attention. And next topic is for Joyce to discuss. Joyce?
Okay. We are now here in dissociative disorders. In dissociative disorders, this is also called as DD. And we have here the what we call dissociation. And dissociation means to be disconnected from others, from the world around you, or from yourself. Now, what is dissociative disorder then? Dissociative disorders are characterized by a disruption of and/or discontinuity in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, and behavior. In other words, the term dissociative disorder describes a persistent mental state that is marked by feelings of being detached from reality, being outside of one's own body, or experiencing memory loss. And this involves problems with memory, identity, emotion, perception, behavior, sense of self, and other that I've mentioned earlier. So, if a person has naisakit na dissociative disorder or part ng dissociative disorders, since dagan-dagan masad ini sila, ang symptoms ng ini can potentially disrupt every area of psychological functioning. And in this chapter, it includes dissociative identity disorder, dissociative identity disorder, dissociative amnesia, and depersonalization derealization disorder. Okay, so in depersonalization derealization disorder, it has the alteration in the experience of the self and reality. Later on, we will discuss this one. Sa dissociative amnesia sad na ija 3 types. We have here the generalized amnesia, localized or selective, and the subtype of dissociative amnesia, which is ang dissociative fugue. And we also have the dissociative identity disorder or DID. So, when we say DID, it is an inability to recall important autobiographical information. So, later on, ato ini si Jay discuss tanan. So, let's start with the depersonalization derealization disorder. So, here, in depersonalization derealization disorder or DDD, it is characterized by clinically significant persistent or recurrent depersonalization and or derealization. So, unsa may pasabot ng depersonalization? Ang depersonalization, it refers to an individual na naka-feel or naka-experience ng detachment from one's mind, self, or body. Whereas, when we say derealization, it refers to an individual na naka-experience ng detachment from one's surroundings. So, amo dyan ang ilakalainan. Ang depersonalization kay detachment from one's mind, self, or body, tapos ang derealization kay sa surroundings. And as I mentioned earlier, inisdya na type ng disorder has alteration in the experience of the self and reality. Okay, so diin man gikan inin mga alterations. These alterations of experience are accompanied by intact reality testing, and there is no evidence of any distinction between individuals with predominantly depersonalization versus derealization symptoms. Therefore, individuals with this disorder can have either depersonalization or derealization, or it can be both. Like both nila ma-experience in na disorder. Like detachment from one's surroundings o atong sa depersonalization na maka-experience sila ng detachment from one's mind, self, or body. Okay, so para mas masabtan, let's take the case of Bonnie. Bonnie, a dance teacher in her late 20s, was accompanied by her husband when she first visited the clinic and complained of flipping out. When asked what she meant, she said, "It's the most scary thing in the world. It often happens when I'm teaching my modern dance class. I'll be up in front and I will feel focused on. Then, as I'm demonstrating the steps, I just feel like it's not really me and that I don't really have control of my legs. Sometimes I feel like I'm standing in back of myself just watching. Also, I get tunnel vision. It seems like I can only see in a narrow space right in front of me, and I just get totally separated from what's going on around me. Then I begin to panic and perspire and shake. It turns out that Bonnie's problems began after she smoked marijuana for the first time about 10 years before. She had the same feeling then and found it scary. But with the help of friends, she got through it. Lately, the feeling recurred more often and more severely, particularly when she was teaching dance class. So, in her case, her flipping out, which she referred as totally separated from what's going on around her, began after she smoked marijuana for the first time, about 10 years before. Further to that, the symptoms of this disorder show that during such episodes, the person is aware of their surroundings and know that what they are experiencing is not normal. And that's what happened to Bonnie. Ang symptoms said ng disorder may start as early as childhood, with 16 years old being the average of first experience. Tapos fewer than 20% will have their first experience of the said disorder after age 20. So si Bonnie na experience niya adto na experience during her late 20s. So to sum up the case of Bonnie, naka-experience siya ng depersonalization. Kay nga anuman, she felt man na murag na detach siya sa ija self or body, and makita sab ni ija self na sa likod ng ija self. Like, mato ija mention kanina, makita ni ija na nag-stand siya sa likod ng ija body. And she can't even move. So, amo dyan ang mga symptoms. Di siya makalihok. So, talking about the diagnostic criteria for this disorder, it has the presence of persistent or recurrent experiences of depersonalization, derealization, or both. And mausad ang nayatabo kang Bonnie. Mas nagbalik-balik atong ija ko an experience. So again, ang depersonalization, experiences of unreality, detachment, or being an outside observer with respect to one's thoughts, feelings, sensations, body, or actions. Whereas derealization refer to the experiences of unreality or detachment with respect to surroundings. The second criterion for this disorder is that during the depersonalization or derealization experience, reality testing remains intact. So, amo to ko mention kanina na naay alteration in the experience of the self and reality. The third criterion is that the symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. The disturbance is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance or another medical condition. And lastly, the disturbance is not better explained by another mental disorder such as schizophrenia or panic disorder. So we are now here sa treatments for DDD. So the treatments would be long-term psychotherapy and also treatment of associated trauma similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, and this might be a lifelong condition without treatment. Okay, we are now here sa dissociative amnesia or known as DA. So if a person has this kind of disorder, naay tendency na dili niya ma-remember ang important personal information. So, para mas masabta nato, let's have the case of the woman who lost her memory. Several years ago, a woman in her early 50s brought her daughter to one of our clinics because of the girl's refusal to attend school and other severely disruptive behavior. The father, who refused to come to the session, was quarrelsome, a heavy drinker, and on occasion, abusive. The girl's brother, now in his mid-20s, lived at home and was a burden on the family. Several times a week, a major battle erupted, complete with shouting, pushing, and shoving as each member of the family blamed the others for all their problems. The mother, a strong woman, was clearly the peacemaker responsible for holding the family together. Approximately every 6 months, usually after a family battle, the mother lost her memory and the family had her admitted to the hospital. After a few days away from the turmoil, the mother regained her memory and went home, only to repeat the cycle in the coming months. Although we did not treat this family, the situation resolved itself when the children moved away and the stress decreased. Okay, in dissociative amnesia, again, it means not being able to recall information about one's past or kanang unable to remember important personal information. And this is not the same as simply being forgetful, as it is usually related to a traumatic or particularly stressful event or period of time. Just like in her case, an episode of amnesia comes on suddenly og nibalik ra sab dadyon siya. I mean, ang ija memory nibalik ra dadyon after a stressful event. Thus, when her children moved away, that's when her stress decreased. Amo to nibalik ng ija memories. So, as mentioned earlier, there are 3 types of amnesia. First one is generalized amnesia, and this refers to a complete loss of memory for one's life history, and this is considered as rare. Individuals with generalized amnesia may forget personal identity, and some of them lose previous knowledge about the world, such as semantic knowledge, and can no longer access well-learned skills like procedural knowledge. In other words, ang generalized amnesia refers to a complete loss of identity of life history, like they are unable to remember anything, including who they are. We also have localized or selective amnesia. Ang localized amnesia is a failure to recall events during a circumscribed period of time. When we say circumscribed here, it refers to a restricted period of time. And ini siya klase na amnesia, ang localized, kay most common form ini siya ng dissociative amnesia. And localized amnesia may be broader than amnesia for a single traumatic event. For example, months or years ikaw na-associate sa isa ka child. Like for example, ikaw na-abuse ka. Like when you were a child, na-abuse na ka for months or years. Or na-expose ka sa intense combat. So there's a tendency na ma-trauma ka because of those experiences. So, there's a tendency na ma-occur ini siya, ang localized amnesia. In selective amnesia naman, the individual can recall some, but not all of the events during a circumscribed period of time. Thus, the individual may remember part of a traumatic event, but not other parts. Some individuals report both localized and selective amnesia. Like, for instance, kasagaran do sa mga individuals or some individuals they tend to tell their psychologist or sa clinic na both amnesia ang ilang experience, like both localized and selective. Sa DDD or derealization depersonalization. The duration of the forgotten events can range from minutes to decades. Some episodes of dissociative amnesia resolve rapidly. Example, when the person is removed from combat or some other stressful situation. Same sa case ng the woman who lost her memory. So, pag ma-remove siya dito sa situation, if mawaya siya sa kato na situation, ang ija memory kay mo balik. Whereas other episodes persist for long periods of time, so madugay gajud mo balik ang imong memory kung naasad ka dito naka-expose sa katunay stressful situation. Naisab some individuals na they gradually recall the dissociated memories years later. And last sa dissociative amnesia, we have the dissociative fugue. And this is a subtype of dissociative amnesia. And this literally means flight. It happens during unexpected trip. Memory loss is accompanied by purposeful travel or bewildered wandering. In other words, this type of amnesia is caused by an extreme psychological trauma instead of physical trauma, illness, or another medical condition. This is considered as severe and rare. In addition to that, the type of memories that they lose there is a dissociative fugue, sometimes kaya referred to as autobiographical memories. And this condition is a means of escaping a situation of extreme stress that the person can cope with. So, if a person has this type of disorder, there is a tendency na when you are faced with certain challenges that makes you feel extreme stress, which dili na nimo gajud ma-cope, kay ma-occur gajud ini si disorder. Pero depende kung unsa sad kadugayon siya. Kung dali ra ba, like minutes ra ba, hours, years, or perhaps decades. And yeah, this condition may last weeks, months, and sometimes even longer than that. Pero nasa few hours lang, as I mentioned earlier. Kaso, naay pod mga symptoms na ma-occur, such as confusion, sudden lack of attendance at work or avoidance of other places, detachments from their own emotions, and others. Okay, so hapit na gadyo kita. Now, we have Dissociative Identity Disorder or DID. DID is associated with overwhelming experiences, traumatic events, and or abuse that occurred in childhood. DID was previously referred to as multiple personality disorder. People with DID may adopt as many as 100 new identities, and the average number is 15. In some cases, the identities are complete, each with its own behavior, tone of voice, and physical gestures, but in many cases, only a few characteristics are distinct because the identities are only partially independent. So, it is not true that there are multiple complete personalities. Also, according to the diagnostic feature of this disorder, ang dissociative identity disorder is the presence of two or more distinct personality states or an experience of possession. Okay, so if namoy naibawan ng mga cases na naka-experience ng possession, there is a tendency na perhaps that could lead or perhaps that is considered na dissociative identity disorder. However, the majority of possession states around the world are normal, usually if part ng spiritual practice. And if parts ng spiritual practice, there is a tendency na they do not meet criteria for dissociative identity disorder. However, again, if, for example, mamit manggaling niya ang diagnostic criteria ng DID or dissociative identity disorder, diyan na nato malaong na dili kadto possession, rather that is considered na dissociative identity disorder. Further to that, the overtness or covertness of these personality states, however, varies as a function of psychological motivation, current level of stress, culture, internal conflicts and dynamics, and emotional resilience. Sustained periods of identity disruption may occur when psychosocial pressures are severe and or prolonged. Okay, I mentioned earlier the word overtness and covertness. When we say overtness or overt, it refers to a behavior that can be observed in the form of actions or verbal expressions. Whereas covertness, these are the behaviors that cannot be observed. So, amo dyan ila kalahian. Now, let's read the case of Jonah. Jonah, 27 years old and black, suffered from severe headaches that were unbearably painful and lasted for increasingly longer periods. Furthermore, he couldn't remember things that happened while he had a headache, except that sometimes a great deal of time passed. Finally, after a particularly bad night, when he could stand it no longer, he arranged for admission to the local hospital. What prompted Jonah to come to the hospital, however, was that other people told him what he did during his severe headaches. For example, he was told that the night before he had a violent fight with another man and attempted to stab him. He fled the scene and was shot at during a high-speed chase by the police. His wife told him that during a previous headache, he chased her and his 3-year-old daughter out of the house, threatening them with a butcher knife. During his headaches and while he was violent, he called himself Usufa Abdullah, son of Omega. Once he attempted to drown a man in a river, the man survived and Jonah escaped by swimming a quarter of a mile upstream. He woke up the next morning in his own bed, soaking wet with no memory of the incident. Okay, in his case, it showed that few personalities and different behaviors have occurred in Jonah's self or body, and he can't remember what was happened after those fights and incidents he had gone through. Further to that, during his hospitalization, the staff was able to observe, amo na diri ang ato gitawag na overt. They were able to observe his behavior directly, both when he had headaches and during other periods that he did not remember. He claimed other names at these times, according to the staff, acted differently, and generally seemed to be another person entirely. So ang staff, they distinguished 3 separate identities, or ining 3 separate identities kay gitawag sa dinhi sa na alters. In addition to Jonah, atong 3 separate identities or alters, amo tong addition kan Jonah. So the first alter was named Sammy. Sammy seemed irrational, calm, and in control. The second alter is named King Young, which seemed to be in charge of all sexual activity and was particularly interested in having as many heterosexual interactions as possible. The third alter was the violent and dangerous Usufa Abdullah. So, characteristically, si Jonah, way dya kay mangkaagon about the 3 alters. Pero si Sammy was most aware of the other personalities. Si King Yang and Usufa Abdullah knew a little bit about the others, but only indirectly. Further to DID, it has 3 characteristics. And earlier, I already mentioned the first characteristic, and it is the alter, which refers to different identities or personalities, or kagay na gitawag na separate identities. Kanina gitawag siya na separate identities. We also have the host, the second characteristic. So, ang host attempts to hold various fragments of identity together but end up being overwhelmed. Usually, the host personality develops later. Lastly, the switch. Ang switch is the transition from one personality to another. When this happens, physical transformations may occur during switches, such as posture, facial expressions, patterns of facial wrinkling, and even physical disabilities may emerge. Consequently, Jonah was diagnosed of DID after meeting the criteria for diagnosis. Further to that, the criteria for diagnosis include disruption of identity characterized by two or more distinct personality states, which may be described in some cultures as an experience of possession. The disruption of marked discontinuity in sense of self and sense of agency, accompanied by related alterations in affect, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, cognition, and or sensory motor functioning. These signs and symptoms may be observed by others or reported by the individual. The second criterion is that recurrent gaps in the recall of everyday events, important personal information, and or traumatic events that are inconsistent with ordinary forgetting. The symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. The disturbance is not a normal part of a broadly accepted cultural or religious practice. So, note that in children, the symptoms are not attributable to imaginary playmates or other fantasy play. Lastly, the symptoms are not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance or another medical condition. So, talking about the treatment, ang treatment ng DID, it physically involves psychotherapy. The goal of therapy is to help integrate the different elements of identity, and this may be intense and difficult because it involves remembering and coping with past traumatic experiences. Moreover, we also have the associated features supporting diagnosis. So, individuals with dissociative identity disorder typically present with comorbid depression. So, if kabalang isa ka tawo na IDID, typical na gud sa ila na ay present na comorbid depression, anxiety, substance abuse, self-injury, non-epileptic seizures, or another common symptom. They often conceal or are not fully aware of disruptions in consciousness, amnesia, or other dissociative symptoms. Also, talking about the development and course, ang dissociative identity disorder is associated, again, I mentioned this earlier, with overwhelming experiences, traumatic events, and or abuse occurring in childhood. The full disorder may first manifest at almost any age, like from earliest childhood to late life. So, ang dissociation in children may generate problems with memory, concentration, attachment, and traumatic play. And that ends our discussion. Thank you.